They sent her to a place of endings, a tomb of rock and silence, and expected her to be invisible. In the end, they saw nothing else. They gave a captain, forged in the fire of fleet command, authority over a mountain, and she learned too late that the mountain had its own authority and its own voice. It spoke a language of pressure and time, of fracture and stress, and only one person in that cold gray hell was listening. This is the story of that captain's mistake, of a quiet woman who understood the stone, and of the day the head of the table became the most dangerous seat in the world. The silence in forward operating base terminus was not an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was a physical weight composed of 1,000,000 tons of lithic ice composite pressing down from above, and the hard vacuum pressing in from the outside. The air, recycled to a state of sterile perfection, hummed at a frequency just below conscious hearing, a constant reminder of the fragile technology that held the void at bay. The base was a dagger thrust into the heart of the Tartarus Range on Lethe, a moon whose only strategic value was its utter desolation and its stable orbit over a contested gas giant. It was a place of watching, of waiting, and of a slow, grinding erosion of the soul. Dr. Eris Thorne felt the silence not as an oppression, but as a medium. It was a carrier wave for the moon's own deep, slow pulse. She sat at a workstation tucked into a geological survey alcove, away from the sterile white corridors of the command and control center. Her corner was a chaotic intrusion of the real. Trays of core samples lined the shelves, each a cylinder of gray, black, and crystalline history. The air here smelled different, of ozone from the spectrometer and the faint, dusty scent of pulverized rock. Her screen was not filled with tactical overlays or troop movements, but with seismic velocity models and tomographic scans of the mountain's interior. She traced a finger along a hairline fracture in a piece of gabbro, its dark surface cool and dense. The fracture was new, microscopic, but it told a story of stress that the base's extensive network of strain gauges had missed. They measured the mountain. She listened to it. Her presence at Terminus was an anomaly, a bureaucratic footnote. She was a civilian contractor, a geostrategic analyst attached to a deep-range reconnaissance unit. Her official function was to assess planetary stability for long-term installations. To the rotating military personnel, she was simply the Rock Lady, a quiet, unassuming figure who seemed more interested in pebbles than in the simmering conflict brewing in the system. She wore simple gray fatigues without rank or insignia. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot, and her face, pale from the recycled light, was most often illuminated by the cool glow of a data slate. She moved through the base like a ghost, her steps sure but silent, her observations constant but unvoiced. The relative quiet of her tenure was shattered by the arrival of Captain Eva Rostova. Rostova did not simply arrive. She announced herself with the percussive shockwave of a priority shuttle docking with unnecessary force. Her voice, a blunt instrument honed in the command decks of battleships, preceded her through the corridors, barking orders and demanding reports that were already filed. She was a creature of polished brass, starched uniforms, and absolute certainty. Her worldview was a simple binary system. There were orders and there was obedience. There was protocol and there was failure. The nuances of a place like Terminus, a place built on the quiet language of rock and shadow, were utterly lost on her. Rostova's first official act was to call a full command briefing. She strode into the briefing room, a sterile amphitheater of gray metal and holographic displays, and the atmosphere immediately changed. The low, professional hum of the command staff was replaced by a taut, nervous energy. Rostova's eyes, the color of cold steel, swept the room, cataloging, judging, dismissing. Her gaze fell upon the head of the long, U-shaped table. The center seat, the command seat, was occupied. Eris sat there, a data slate in her hands, her focus entirely on the intricate stress vectors displayed on its surface. She had chosen the seat not for its symbolic power, but for its optimal access to the main holographic display and its direct terminal link to the base's geological sensor array. It was a position of function, not of status. To her, it was simply the most efficient place to work. She felt the shift in the room's pressure before she heard the voice. It was a subtle change in the ambient acoustics, the way sound was suddenly absorbed by 24 stiffened spines. Then the voice came, sharp and corrosive. "You don't sit there," Captain Rostova snapped. The statement was not a request. It was a verdict. It sliced through the quiet hum of the briefing room, and every head turned. They saw their new, formidable commander radiating authority and indignation, and they saw the quiet civilian, the ghost from the geology lab, sitting in the captain's chair as if it were a park bench. Eris looked up slowly. Her eyes, a deep, startlingly clear gray, met Rostova's. There was no defiance in her gaze, no surprise, merely a quiet, analytical assessment. She took in the captain's rigid posture, the slight flare of her nostrils, the tension in her jaw. These were data points, indicators of a predictable emotional state. "This seat has the best resolution for the deep strata resonance monitors," Eris stated. Her voice was calm, level, and utterly devoid of inflection. It was a statement of fact, offered as one might observe that the sky was black. It carried no apology, no justification, only information. Rostova's face tightened. The simplicity of the response, its logical purity, was a greater insult than open defiance would have been. It bypassed the entire framework of rank and protocol upon which her identity was built. "I don't care if it projects in 13 dimensions. That is the command seat. My seat. Get up." The room held its breath. The first challenge had been issued. The new hierarchy was being forged in this small, pointless crucible. A young lieutenant, Kalen Yorick, the base's lead signals analyst, watched from his position on the periphery. He had worked with Eris on several occasions, feeding her sensor data from his long-range arrays. He had been consistently baffled and impressed by her ability to predict minute seismic shifts and energy fluctuations hours before his own advanced equipment could confirm them. He saw the captain's raw power play, but he also saw the unshakable calm in Eris Thorne. It was not the calm of ignorance, but of something far deeper. Eris considered the captain's command. She ran a quick mental calculation. The energy cost of moving, gathering her slate, her instruments, finding a new position, recalibrating her access, versus the energy cost of this escalating social friction. The captain was an immovable object by definition of her rank. The logical course was to acquiesce. Yet, her analysis of the new microfractures suggested a growing instability in the tectonic plate on which Terminus was built. The data from this specific terminal was critical. Without breaking eye contact, Eris slid the data slate across the smooth, cold surface of the table toward the adjacent seat. Then, with an economy of motion that was almost unnerving, she stood, picked up the chair, and moved it one space to the left. She placed it down without a sound, sat, and pulled the data slate back in front of her. She had obeyed the letter of the command. She was no longer in that seat, but in doing so, she had taken the head of the table with her. The command position was now wherever she sat. A low, strangled sound escaped someone in the back of the room. Captain Rostova's face went from steel to slate, a dark, thunderous cloud of fury. She had expected submission or argument. She had not expected this logical, insolent compliance. It was a move of such breathtaking audacity, wrapped in a shell of perfect obedience, that it left her momentarily speechless. She had been outmaneuvered, not by a challenge to her authority, but by a complete refusal to even acknowledge the paradigm of authority she was trying to impose. "What is your name?" Rostova's voice was low now, a dangerous hum. "Dr. Eris Thorne," she replied, her eyes already back on the swirling colored lines of her slate. "Geostrategic analyst." "I will have you on the next transport off this rock, Doctor," Rostova bit out, her emphasis on the title turning it into an epithet. Eris did not look up. "That would be inadvisable. The mountain is becoming unstable." A wave of dismissive laughter, sharp and ugly, came from Rostova. "The mountain is unstable? This base is bored a kilometer deep into the most stable cratonic shield on this moon. It's rated to withstand a direct tactical nuclear strike. I have read the geological surveys." "The surveys are out of date," Eris said, her tone still flat, factual. "They measure stress. They do not measure resonance." Rostova slammed her hand down on the table. The sound was a gunshot in the tense silence. "Enough of this nonsense. This briefing will come to order. Someone get me a chair." She refused to take the now empty seat, the one that had been the center of the conflict. To do so would be to admit defeat. Instead, a junior officer scurried to fetch another chair, placing it awkwardly at the head of the table, slightly off-center from the main display. The captain sat, rigid with fury, her authority already cracked before she had even begun. The balance of power in the room had been subtly, irrevocably altered. Lieutenant Jorik watched Arius, who seemed to have forgotten the entire exchange, her focus absolute. He felt a cold premonition creep up his spine. The captain saw a discipline problem. Jorik was beginning to suspect they were all standing on a fault line, and only one person in the room knew how to read the signs. The days that followed settled into a pattern of escalating friction. Captain Rostova managed Terminus like a warship. She ran drills at all hours, demanded hourly readiness reports, and instituted a rigid protocol for everything from mess hall seating to communication syntax. Her leadership was a blunt instrument, and she wielded it against the silent, unyielding presence of Eris Thorne. She buried Eris in requisitions, denied her priority access to sensor arrays, and publicly belittled her work as academic hysteria. Each move was designed to isolate and humiliate the woman who had so effortlessly undermined her on her first day. Eris, for her part, seemed not to notice. She simply adapted. When Rostova denied her access to the main seismic array, she recalibrated long-range acoustic sensors to listen to the deep rock. When her requests for more processing power were rejected, she wrote a more efficient algorithm that did more with less. She was a system adapting to a hostile environment, her focus unwavering. She continued to collect her samples, analyze her data, and update her models. Her warnings about the mountain's growing instability, delivered in concise, emotionless reports, were filed and ignored. Lieutenant Jorik became an unwilling bridge between the two poles of power. Rostova saw him as a competent, if overly inquisitive, officer. He saw Eris as a Cassandra, a prophet whose warnings were being willfully disregarded. He started feeding her data discreetly, running passive scans she requested on back-channel processors. He would find her in her alcove, surrounded by her rocks, and ask a simple question about a data anomaly he had noticed. Her answers were always precise and always unsettling. "The micro-tremors are organizing," she told him one evening, pointing to a complex waveform on her screen. "They're not random anymore. They're developing a harmonic pattern. Something is exciting them." "Subsurface magma flow?" Yorick offered, reciting the standard geological explanation. "No," Eris said, shaking her head slightly. "The thermal scans are flat. This isn't heat, it's sound, or something like it. An external frequency is being introduced into the system. The mountain is beginning to resonate." She looked at him then, her gray eyes holding his. "A glass can shatter from a single, sustained note, Lieutenant. This mountain is made of glass." The crisis, when it came, did not arrive with the roar of an explosion or the flash of a plasma bolt. It began, as Aris had predicted, with a hum. It was a low, pervasive thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was not a sound heard with the ears, but a vibration felt deep in the bones, in the teeth. It was the frequency of dread. The lights in the command center flickered, the polished floor plates vibrated, and a fine dust, shaken from a million hidden crevices, began to drift down from the ceiling. "Report!" Rostova's voice cut through the rising tension. "External sensors are blind, Captain," an ensign called out, his voice tight. "Massive EM interference. It's blanketing the entire range. Hostile fleet? Negative. No thermal blooms, no engine signatures. It's just noise. White noise on every band." Jorik was at his console, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. "It's not white noise," he said, his voice strained. "It's patterned. There's a carrier wave, but it's phase shifted into the substrate. It's not being broadcast through the air, it's being transmitted through the rock." The hum intensified. A deep, grinding groan echoed through the superstructure of the base. On the main display, a schematic of Terminus began to flash with dozens of red warning icons. Structural integrity failing, power conduits shearing, atmospheric seals threatening to breach. "Damage control teams, report!" Rostova commanded, her voice a solid anchor in the growing chaos. "Seal all sectors, reinforce primary supports." Her orders were conventional. They were correct. They were what the manual dictated for a seismic event or a direct attack. They were also utterly, completely useless. This was not an earthquake. It was a deconstruction. The enemy had not brought a hammer to break the rock. They had brought a tuning fork. They were not attacking the base. They were unmaking the mountain it was built in. Eris Thorne walked into the command center. She moved with a strange, deliberate grace through the vibrating chaos, her eyes scanning the failing systems and the panicked faces of the crew. She held a core sample in one hand, a dark piece of gneiss banded with crystalline quartz. She stopped beside Yorik's station. "The frequency is 7.2 hertz, she said, her voice perfectly calm, cutting through the din. "The resonant frequency of the quartz intrusions in this stratum. They're using the mountain itself as a transducer." Rostova whirled on her. "I gave you a direct order to stay in your lab, Thorne. Security, get her off my bridge!" Two security officers moved toward Aris, but they were unsteady on the vibrating deck. A hairline crack appeared on the armored glass of the main viewport, spreading like a spider's web. A collective gasp went through the room. The mountain, their fortress, was breaking. "Your reinforcements won't work, Captain," Eris said, her gaze fixed on the spreading crack. "You are trying to strengthen the glass while it is still ringing. You cannot stop the vibration. You have to cancel the wave." "And how do you propose we do that, Doctor?" Rostova sneered, her face a mask of contempt and fear. "Sing it a lullaby?" Eris turned her head and looked directly at the captain. For the first time, there was something other than detached analysis in her eyes. It was a flicker of cold, hard certainty, the look of a weapon that has just been aimed. "No," she said, "we shout back." The moment hung in the air, thick with ozone and the grinding sound of dying rock. Rostova stared, her mind unable to process the sheer absurdity of the statement. But Yorick, his mind racing, saw the terrifying logic. Destructive interference. A counterwave. He looked from Eris to his console, which showed the enemy signal, a perfect, repeating sine wave being pumped into the moon's crust. "Captain," Yorick said, his voice urgent, "she's right. Theoretically, if we could generate a signal of the same frequency, but exactly 180 degrees out of phase." "With what, Lieutenant?" Rostova shouted, gesturing wildly at the failing systems. "Our main comms array is down. We can't even broadcast a distress signal." "We don't need the comms array," Aris said, stepping past the hesitant security guards. She walked to the main holographic display, which now showed a catastrophic cascade of system failures. With a few deft gestures, she swiped away the warnings and pulled up a schematic of the base's power core and its network of seismic dampeners. The seismic dampeners were massive piston-like mechanisms designed to absorb and nullify the effects of natural moonquakes. They were defensive systems meant to absorb energy. "They're absorbers," Eris explained, her voice taking on a pedagogical tone, as if lecturing a class. "But their magnetic field generators are bidirectional. If we reverse the polarity and overload the power conduits, we can turn them into emitters. We can make them broadcast instead of listen." The sheer, insane elegance of the idea stunned the command staff into silence. To take a system designed to protect them from the mountain and use it to turn the mountain itself into a weapon. It was impossible. It was brilliant. "That's insane," the chief engineer stammered from his station. "Overloading the core like that would bypass every safety protocol. It could create a feedback loop that would slag the entire facility in seconds. The dampeners were never designed to handle that kind of power output." "They will handle it for 1.4 seconds, Eris stated, not as a hope, but as a fact. Long enough to generate a single, phase-inverted pulse. It will be enough." Rostova looked at the faces of her crew. She saw their terror, but she also saw a dawning, desperate hope turning toward the quiet woman in the gray fatigues. Her authority, built on the bedrock of protocol and rank, was crumbling as surely as the mountain around them. The choice was simple. Follow the book into their tomb, or follow the madwoman into a sliver of impossible light. Her pride, her career, her entire identity screamed at her to refuse. "Do it," Yorick said, his voice quiet but firm. He turned to his console and, without waiting for the captain's confirmation, began rerouting auxiliary power to the dampener control systems. It was an act of open mutiny. One by one, other officers turned to their stations, looking to Aris for instructions. An engineer began pulling up power core schematics. A weapons tech started calculating field strength projections. Command authority did not transfer with an order. It flowed, like water, to the point of lowest pressure, to the place where a solution existed. In that moment of collective paralysis, Eris Thorn became the center of gravity for the entire base. Rostova stood frozen, a statue of obsolete power. She had lost. She knew it. The quiet civilian had not seized command. It had been given to her by the sheer, undeniable force of her competence. Eris began to issue orders. Her voice remained calm, a steady, analytical thread weaving through the chaotic symphony of destruction. Jorik, I need you to isolate the enemy carrier wave, filter out all ambient noise, and give me a pure signal. I need to match the phase lock to within 3 decimal points. Working on it, he replied, his hands a blur. The signal is degrading as our own systems fail, but I can still isolate the primary frequency. Engineer, Eris continued, turning to the man who had protested moments before. I need you to begin a full power shunt from the primary core to the seismic dampener grid. Bypass the regulators, all of them. I want the core running at 150% of maximum theoretical output. The conduit systems will begin to melt, so you will have a very small window to execute the transfer. The engineer swallowed hard, his face pale, but he nodded. What's the window? When I give the order, you will have precisely 3 seconds to open the gates. Any longer, and the feedback will vaporize us. Any shorter, and the pulse won't have enough energy to propagate. 3 seconds, he breathed. He turned to his console, his expression now one of terrified focus. Aris's gaze swept the room, her mind a whirlwind of calculations, processing the flow of information as if she were the base's central computer. She was no longer just a geologist. She was a conductor, and her orchestra was a dying mountain base, its instruments power conduits and magnetic fields. The music she was about to create was the sound of salvation or annihilation. All other departments, she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that was absolute. Secure your stations for extreme structural shock. Strap in. The counterwave will not be subtle. When our pulse meets theirs, the entire mountain is going to flex. The groaning of the base intensified. A section of the ceiling plating tore loose and crashed to the floor, showering sparks. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the stark, crimson glow of emergency lighting. The world was reduced to red light and black shadows, the faces of the crew illuminated like souls in purgatory. I have the signal locked, Jorik shouted over the noise. Phase is stable. It's beautiful in a horrifying way, a perfect, clean wave. Put it on my screen, Eris ordered. A holographic representation of the enemy's sine wave appeared before her, a glowing red line of pure destruction. Beside it, she began to model her own. A blue wave. She adjusted its amplitude, tweaked its frequency, and then, with a final, delicate touch, she inverted its phase. The 2 waves were now perfect mirror images of each other. Engineer, status on the core? It's redlining, Doctor. The containment fields are screaming. I can't hold it like this for long. You don't have to, Eris said calmly. She looked at the model of her counterwave, her head tilted in final, silent contemplation. It was a terrifyingly elegant equation. The enemy had turned the strength of the mountain against them, using its crystalline structure to amplify their weapon. Eris was about to do the same, to turn the base's heart, its power core, into a weapon of her own. A single, perfectly timed, perfectly shaped note of defiance. She took a deep breath. The air was thick with the smell of burning electronics and the primal scent of fear. She saw the faces around her, all turned to her, their trust a palpable force. She saw Rostova, standing alone in the shadows, a ghost at her own funeral. Yorick, synchronize the dampener release to my mark. Engineer, prepare to open the conduits. Standing by, they replied in unison. The base gave a violent shudder, and the crack on the viewport splintered, a network of fractures racing across the thick plasteel. They were out of time. Eris looked at the two waves, the red and the blue, poised for their collision. Now, she said. The engineer slammed his hand down on a console. A deep, gut-wrenching roar filled the base as 1,000,000 gigawatts of raw power were ripped from the core and hurled into the seismic dampeners. For a heartbeat, the base's internal gravity fluctuated, and a wave of intense heat washed through the command center. The emergency lights flickered wildly. Yorick, his timing perfect, triggered the release. There was no sound. Not at first. The first effect of the pulse was a total, deafening absence of vibration. The grinding, the humming, the shaking, it all just stopped. It was as if the universe had been paused. For one single, terrifying moment, the silence was absolute, more profound and more frightening than the chaos it had replaced. In that silence, every member of the crew felt a bizarre, internal lurch, as if their own skeletons had been struck by a tuning fork. Then came the flex, a low-frequency wave, the physical manifestation of Eris's counterpulse, radiated outward from the base. It was not a shock wave of destruction, but one of pure force. The entire mountain, 1,000,000,000 tons of rock and ice, visibly rippled. The command center deck buckled upward, then slammed back down. The walls groaned, not in failure, but in a deep, resonant complaint, like a bell being struck. The cracked viewport held. And then it was over. The silence that returned was different. It was not the oppressive silence of before, nor the deafening pause of the pulse. It was a true silence. The absence of the enemy's hum. The absence of the mountain's death throes. The only sounds were the panicked gasps of the crew, the frantic whirring of emergency cooling systems, and the gentle, rhythmic beep of a single, functioning sensor. Yorick stared at his screen, his mouth agape. The glowing red line of the enemy's carrier wave had vanished. Not faded, not diminished. Vanished. In its place was a chaotic scramble of feedback and static. "Signal terminated," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "The carrier wave is gone. The source is screaming. It's pure, uncontrolled energy feedback. Whatever was generating that frequency just blew itself apart." He looked up at Eris. She stood perfectly still, her hand resting on the console, her expression unreadable. She had not just canceled the wave. She had caught it, inverted it, and sent it back down the line to its source. She had used the enemy's own weapon, amplified by the power of the mountain and the heart of the base, to strike back. It was not defense. It was a counterattack of such devastating elegance that it bordered on art. Slowly, the base's primary systems began to reboot. The crimson emergency lights gave way to the steady, cool white of the main lighting grid. The tactical display flickered back to life, no longer filled with warnings, but with a clear, calm map of the surrounding space. A new icon appeared on that map, a priority communication channel, hailing them from a secure military frequency, slicing through the residual interference with contemptuous ease. It was a fleet command channel. "Captain Rostova," Yorick said, his voice now steady, professional, though his eyes never left Aris. "We have an incoming hail, flagship Indomitable. It's Admiral Vance." Rostova, who had been leaning against a bulkhead, as if the life had been drained from her, straightened up. The name of the fleet admiral was a jolt of cold water, pulling her back into the world of hierarchy and regulation she understood. It was a lifeline. "On screen," she ordered, her voice raspy but regaining its familiar, sharp edge. She strode back toward the center of the room, attempting to reclaim the ground she had lost. The face of Admiral Vance materialized on the main viewer. He was a man whose age was impossible to determine, his face a landscape of calm authority and quiet intelligence. He did not look pleased or relieved. He looked like a man who had been expecting this call. "Captain Rostova," he began, his voice a calm baritone that commanded instant respect. "I have a chaotic energy reading on my tactical display, originating from your position. It appears you've just weathered a rather significant event. Report." Rostova opened her mouth, ready to deliver her version of events, to frame the disaster and the recovery in a way that preserved her command. But before she could speak, Vance held up a hand. "Actually, retract that order," the Admiral said, his eyes scanning something off-screen. "The initial report I'm receiving is unorthodox. I'm not interested in a filtered summary, Captain. I want to speak with the person responsible for the resonant counterpulse. I want to speak to Chimera." The name fell into the room like a stone into a still pond. Chimera. It was a code name, one whispered about in the highest echelons of fleet command and intelligence. A ghost. A myth. A theoretical warfare project that was said to combine disparate, unrelated fields of science into a new form of weapon. Geology and acoustics. Network theory and psychology. No one knew who or what Chimera was. It was a legend. Captain Rostova stared blankly. "Admiral, I don't understand. There is no one here by that name." Admiral Vance's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked past Rostova, his gaze sweeping the command center, and then he stopped. His eyes locked onto the quiet figure of Eris Thorne. A flicker of recognition, of understanding, crossed his face. "Is there not?" he asked softly. He addressed his next words not to Rostova, but directly to Eris. "Dr. Thorne, your work continues to be impactful. The enemy fleet is in full retreat. Their lead ship appears to have suffered a catastrophic core breach. Your hypothesis regarding resonant cascade failure was, it seems, conservative." Every eye in the room swiveled to Eris, the rock lady, the quiet civilian, Chimera. The revelation was a physical shock, recontextualizing everything about her. Her quiet confidence, her unnerving calm, her impossible knowledge. She was not an analyst who had stumbled upon a solution. She was the solution, sent to this place to wait for a problem that only she could solve. Aris simply inclined her head in a small, respectful gesture. "The model was sound, Admiral. The execution was adequate." The sheer understatement of her words was more powerful than any boast. Rostova looked back and forth between the Admiral and Aris, her face a canvas of dawning horror and disbelief. She had not been dealing with a difficult subordinate. She had been ordering a legend to fetch her a chair. The full, crushing weight of her arrogance, of her catastrophic misjudgment, settled upon her. "Admiral," Rostova began, her voice a weak rasp. I was not aware of the doctor's special status." Vance's expression became glacial. "Your awareness, Captain, is not the issue. Your judgment is. You had a specialist on site. A specialist whose entire purpose is to understand and neutralize precisely this kind of unconventional threat. You were given reports. You were given warnings. You chose to ignore them in favor of protocol and pride. You saw a threat to your authority when you should have seen the key to your survival. He paused, letting the indictment hang in the silent room. Captain Eva Rostova, Admiral Vance said, his voice now cold and formal. You are hereby relieved of command of FOB Terminus, effective immediately. You will be confined to your quarters pending a full inquiry. Lieutenant Jorik. Jorik snapped to attention. Sir, you will assume temporary command of the base. Your primary duty is to render any and all assistance Dr. Thorne requires. Is that understood? Yes, Admiral, Jorik said, his voice firm. He glanced at Aris, his expression one of profound, humbled respect. Good. Vance looked one last time at Aris. Chimera, complete your assessment. When you are done, a transport will be dispatched for you. Vance out. The Admiral's face vanished, leaving behind a stunned command center and the wreckage of a captain's career. Rostova stood for a long moment, her face ashen. She looked at Aris, at the woman she had tried to break, and saw nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, only the same calm, analytical gaze she had seen from the beginning. Aris had already moved on, her mind already working on the next problem, the aftershocks, the structural repairs, the lingering energy signatures. The personal drama was, to her, irrelevant data. Without another word, Captain Eva Rostova turned and walked off the command deck, her rigid posture the only thing holding her together. The door hissed shut behind her, and a new, quieter order began to settle over Terminus. In the hours that followed, the base came to life with a new purpose. The frantic energy of survival was replaced by a focused, methodical hum of recovery. The crew worked with an efficiency and quiet respect they had never shown under Rostova. Their orders came not from Yorich, who wisely stood back, but indirectly from Aris. She would make a quiet observation to an engineer about stabilizing a power relay, or suggest a new scanning frequency to a sensor tech, and her words were treated as law. She was the center of the base, the quiet, unmoving point around which everything now turned. Late in the next cycle, as the last of the critical repairs were being finalized, Lieutenant Jorik found her back in her alcove. She was seated before her workstation, studying a holographic model of the Tartarus Range. The model now showed a vast, dark lacuna deep within the rock where the enemy's weapon, and presumably its ship, had been. He didn't speak at first, just stood in the doorway, watching her. He had been given command of the base, but he knew who was truly in charge. Finally, he cleared his throat. Dr. Thorne, she turned her head slightly. Commander Jorik, she replied, using his new, temporary title. There was no irony in it, only fact. The preliminary damage reports are in. Structural integrity is at 73%, but holding. We were lucky. Luck is the residue of design, Aris quoted softly, her eyes returning to the screen. The base was well built. It withstood the resonance stress better than my initial models predicted. Jorik stepped closer. He held out a steaming mug. It's coffee, real coffee, from my personal stash. I figured you might want some. It was a simple gesture. Not an award, not a commendation, not a fawning speech. It was a quiet acknowledgement, an offering of respect from one professional to another. Aris looked at the mug, then up at him. She considered it for a moment, as if analyzing its properties. Then she took it, her cool fingers brushing his. Thank you, Kalen, she said, using his first name for the first time. The warmth of the mug seemed to seep into her. He nodded, unsure of what else to say. What you did, I've run the simulations. It shouldn't have worked. The power levels you pushed through the dampeners. By all rights, this entire mountain should be a cloud of radioactive plasma. The models of the engineers were incomplete, Eris explained simply. They accounted for the tensile strength of the alloys and the conduits, but they didn't account for the piezoelectric effect of the surrounding rock. The quartz stratum absorbed a significant portion of the thermal overload, converting it into electrostatic energy, which helped stabilize the containment fields for an additional 0.3 seconds. It was just enough. Jorek just stared at her. She had not only calculated the enemy's weapon and the base's response, but she had factored in the subatomic properties of the very rock they were buried in. He was standing in the presence of a mind so vast, so complex, that he felt like a child looking at the stars. He finally understood. She wasn't a ghost in the machine. She was the consciousness of the mountain itself. "Your transport is scheduled to arrive in 2 hours," he said finally. "I know," she replied. "My work here is done." She left as she had arrived, quietly and without ceremony. The transport shuttle detached from terminus with a barely audible hiss, a small light disappearing into the star-dusted blackness. Down below, on the command deck, Commander Joritz watched it go. The chair at the head of the table was empty now, but it was no longer just a chair. It was a symbol, a reminder that true authority is not claimed by rank or by volume, but earned by competence and vision. Iris Thorne, the woman they called Chimera, was gone, but her legend would be carved into the very stone of that place. She was a quiet professional, a force of nature who came and went like a seismic event, leaving the landscape irrevocably changed. She sought no recognition, no reward. Her satisfaction came from the quiet hum of a problem solved, of an elegant equation balanced. She was a ghost, destined to haunt the quiet, forgotten places where the real wars were fought. Her legacy, not a name in a history book, but a profound and lasting silence where a catastrophe should have been.